All right, so it is 10 till 6 a.m. Time to start making a brisket. This is my flat brisket or brisket flat. It's 9.5 pounds, purchased at a local grocery store. Take the brisket, lay it out on a pan, and not much fat you need to take off of a brisket flat. But you do want to go around with a knife and kind of carve off any of the hard fat that might be along the edges, any fat on the end that might be brown or fat that won't render well while cooking. So not a lot to take off, but just a little bit of trimming. The hard fat's going to be very noticeable. There was a pretty decent amount running along this edge. So again, took out my paring knife and cut a decent amount off. Not all the way down to the beef, but just get the hard fat off. Okay, so it's a pretty standard rub that I'm going to use. I'm using some coarse kosher salt. Again, this is Morton brand. It doesn't really matter what brand. And then just some standard coarse black pepper from my local grocery store. I mix that together. It's a third of each, 1/3 salt to 1/3 pepper, and mix it around in this bowl. You want to keep this moving because that salt will settle at the bottom and throw off the mixture amount. So mix it up good and then spread a thin layer of yellow mustard. I probably went a little bit too heavy here, but you don't have to massage it into the beef, but again, just rub the top, the sides, and again, both top and bottom, both sides, all around the entire brisket. And then add your salt and pepper mix. And again, you're not trying to overdo this. You don't want it thick. You just want a nice coverage. And again, you don't have to massage this in either. Just a light pat on this is enough. Be sure to get those edges, again, both the top, bottom, and all around. One tip I learned from a buddy, he adds a tiny amount of steak seasoning. Again, this is just a light amount to add a little bit additional flavor. And so again, lightly sprinkle that on, and again, just kind of pat it into the meat. No need to massage. Always lay down some type of protective barrier, whether you're on your deck or on concrete. In this case, I just lay down an old box that I've flattened out. Catches any drippings. Plug the smoker in, set the temperature. In my case, I'm setting it to 225. Anywhere between 225 and 250 should be good. I'm doing 225 for 9.5 hours. And then add wood chips. Get her done. And then no matter what type of smoker you're using, I always add a little bit of water. My electric smoker here comes with a water tray, so I'm always sure to fill that up to retain some moisture. And then finally, I use a probe. This was my first brisket ever. I highly recommend, if you're not an expert barbecue person, use some type of probe to check the meat temperature. Internal temperature is critical. All right, put the probe in. I chose the thickest part of the cut, so I know I have a pretty good gauge on where the meat is while it's cooking. Ideal temperature to pull this thing off is going to be around 200 to 203 degrees. Okay, so it's been a little over an hour, 7 o'clock on the dot. The meat's been sitting out. It's warmed up a bit to room temperature. The smoker is at the right temperature, 225. Got the water in, got the wood chips in, and now I'm throwing the brisket in. Now, as soon as I close this door, I will not reopen this smoker until 10 a.m., at least 3 hours. You want to retain that heat. This initial 3 hours is kind of the critical first step in getting the meat nice and smoked and on its way to cooking. You can see I have a nice stream of smoke coming out the top here. You shouldn't have like massive billows of smoke coming out of the stack. You want a nice gray to light blue smoke continually coming out of there, but it should not be like billows of smoke. If that's occurring, something's wrong, whether it's your wood chips or the fire's too hot, the temperature's too high. And then I will be spritzing this with apple cider vinegar. This is the fancy hippie stuff that my wife buys, but any apple cider vinegar, in my opinion, will work. Okay, so 10 a.m. It's been 3 hours exactly. Time to take a quick peek at it and spritz. So as you can see, that bark's beginning to form. Color's looking really good. This spritz is just going to add a little bit more moisture to it to keep it nice and soft again as it continues to cook nice and tender. And again, I don't spend a ton of time, but you want to cover the brisket thoroughly and then shut her up and let her smoke some more. So this will be the last time I add smoke to the, or excuse me, wood chips to the smoker. After about 4 or 5 hours, the wood chips don't really do a whole lot, but I'm going to add one more round, and then for the last probably 3 to 4 hours of this cook, no more wood chips. It'll just cook as it needs to. So 4 hours later, 2 p.m., I pull the brisket off of the smoker, place it on some butcher paper. I give it a nice spritz of the apple cider vinegar again, and then going to wrap this up and throw it back on the smoker. So again, in my opinion, I probably did this a little too early. You could probably wrap it the last hour of cook time. I did it 2 hours ahead of time. That's one thing I would change. I would only wrap it for the last hour next time I do a brisket. The bark, I think, softened up a bit too much. But again, here's how I wrap it. I took the 2 sheets, spread them out, and just make sure you cover it well. I also did reinsert the probe once I had it nice and wrapped. Again, temperature is key here. By the way, I pulled it off at 2 p.m. It was at about 185, so I knew that the last hour to 2 hours of cooking would get it up to 203. All right, so it's 4 o'clock. It's been in there 2 hours. I'm going to lay a towel down and pull the brisket out. The brisket has hit the temperature. I pulled it off at about 202, I believe. I felt around and I felt it was tender enough. Watch your hands too, it's really hot. Pull it off quick, lay it on the towel, and wrap it in that towel for resting period of 1 hour. So the meat will now rest wrapped up in this towel for 1 hour, which would put my eat time right at about 5 to 5:15 p.m.
That's right.
I'm gonna open it.
Okay, so an hour later, moment of truth. What is this thing going to look like? This could be a dream or a worst nightmare. So far, it's looking good. Nice and steamy. Again, the bark was a little moist. It didn't really have that crust-like exterior that I wanted. But again, I think that's because I covered it a little too early. And of course, the scavengers will appear as soon as you pull it out. My wife is watching me. Again, I'm cutting against the grain here. Cutting against the grain. I use a bread knife, a serrated bread knife to cut because this meat is so tender. And I want to keep as much of that bark on as possible. So this is just a nice sharp knife that you traditionally use to cut bread with. I use it on the brisket. And then the test, what they call the pull test. I always cut in about 4 to 5 pieces into the brisket and then remove a piece. And it is hot and steamy, but you don't want it to fall apart. You want it nice and moist. And then the pull test, put it up to the camera. You want it to be able to hang on its own and then fall off the bone kind of tenderness. That's what you're looking for in a brisket. And I must say, for this being my first brisket, it turned out pretty darn good. Not ideal, but more than edible. There you have it. That was it. Again, I was happy with the way it turned out. I wasn't ecstatic. There's a couple things I want to improve, most notably not wrapping it until the last hour. But again, it's a long process, but worth it.
I tried it, but I liked it.
And yes, that is my son eating the remaining salt and pepper mix. I don't know what to say. It was quite shocking. Hope you enjoyed.